A second remark is suggested by the length of the discussion. Mr. Mason, having introduced the subject as an objection which weighs much with conscientious people against his measure, evidently takes it up, not according to the true principles on which the days in question are defended and capable of defense, but according to the absurd and perhaps superstitious views which some, who would be religious overmuch, or have a zeal not altogether produced and directed by knowledge, entertain. This gives him an easy advantage, and furnishes matter for many pages that might well have been spared, pages 61 through 67. The samples of inconsistency and contradiction he professes to exhibit seem to be fabrications of his own mind, and the charge he brings against the supporters of days of beating the air may well be retorted on himself. He approaches the point only when, in page 68, he comes to consider the propriety of fasting in view of some special duty, or in expectation of some special blessings. Thirdly, in managing the objection, he seems to reason in a circle. The objection imports that the measure proposed requires such frequency as would be incompatible with the observance of the usual days. One part of the answer is that this observance of days is attended with great and serious evils, pages 60 and 95. To prove this, we are told that among other evils, the multiplicity of weekday services is incompatible with the frequency intended, page 99. Owing to the indeterminate form in which he has taken up the subject, it would be tedious to follow him through all his discussion. A fair statement of its substance may be sufficient to expose its almost perpetual deviation from the point. The first part of his method is to show that sacramental fast and thanksgiving days have no warrant from the Word of God. If by warrant he means express appointment, it is granted there is none. But in this sense, there is no warrant in the New Testament for any fast or thanksgiving days whatever. Had the exercise of fasting been by divine institution, appointed to precede the celebration of the supper, it had been an essential to the right observance of that ordinance, as it was on the days of annual atonement among the Jews. In no case could it ever have been dispensed with, nor could any individual who had not opportunity of joining with his brethren of other congregations in their sacramental fast have warrantably communicated with them in the supper. Divine wisdom hath laid no such bar in the way of that fellowship for which the ordinance was expressly designed. And since we have never pleaded for fasting or thanksgiving as essentially requisite, we are not confounded by the wonderful discovery that there is no specific ordination of such days, nay, not even a passage from which we may infer an inseparable connection between them and the Holy Supper. Mr. Mason manifestly perplexes the question, while he professes to state it in the most accurate terms. It is not, says he, whether fasting is a divine ordinance, but whether it is a divine ordinance preparative to the Lord's Supper, page 66. From what has been already observed, it must appear that this never was nor can be the question, unless the notion of fastings being absolutely essential were held. The point at issue is not, as the statement implies, whether fasting had been specifically ordained as a part of necessary preparation for keeping the supper. For there is no divinely instituted ritual of fasts or thanksgivings enjoined to the New Testament Church. The appointment of these rests with her courts. The question, therefore, is precisely in the first instance what Mr. Mason would set aside, whether fasting be a divine ordinance. He seems indeed to suppose there are fasts which exhibit general warrants for fasting, that there are texts, which exhibit general warrants for fasting, without respect to the circumstances in which it ought to take place, and alludes with no little indignation to a large column of these he has somewhere seen raised up against his proposed measure. I know no general warrant for fasting, or text which exhibit it as a duty in general, without bearing one way or another on the circumstances in which it either may or ought to take place. Were there any such, then fasts referable to no special occasion would be warranted, and it would be needless any farther to debate whether the sacrament of the supper be a special occasion or not. By the nature of the warrants, however, the question is narrowed to this point: is fasting suitable, seasonable, and proper before the celebration of the supper? That it is, we have endeavored to show in Section 5, and also that on this ground sessions are so vindicated, or have such sufficient warrant for making the appointment that obedience is due, by those under their inspection. Mr. Mason apprehends that our warrants will equally prove the necessity of fasting before baptism, before the Sabbath, before family worship, or craving a blessing to our meat, as before the sacrament of the supper, unless they can be shown to have been coupled with the latter, and not with the former. Page 66. Baptism is a sacrament as really as the supper, and from this consideration the innuendo of its being degraded by the want of a previous fast may be apt to impose on some. But as baptism is not a congregational nor general concern like the supper, it would be improper to appoint a public fast in prospect of its administration. And here a footnote. Mr. Mason admits the distinction himself and has expressed it with sufficient accuracy in page 18. In holy baptism, our profession is separate and public, but not social, at least very imperfectly so. If the person shall choose to seek the Lord by fasting and prayer, with a view to the reception of this ordinance by himself or his children, he would not certainly act an unwarrantable part. Not even though, as patriarch in his own house, he appointed a family fast. Mr. Mason's own reason for discarding the fast with a view to weekly communion is sufficient to expose the absurdity of ordaining such preparation for the Sabbath. It would be a burden to which no congregation either would or should submit. The tribute of time which would be withdrawn from their ordinary occupations would be much too great for any who eat their bread in the sweat of their brow. As for fasting before craving a blessing to our meat, it is only brought in to caricature the subject, and is therefore utterly unworthy of notice. What has been observed may be sufficient to take off the force of the remark made with critical acuteness on the words of the Directory, page 88, as well as the bold assertions of page 105, while it suggests also a solution of the problem considered in the note at the foot of this last page. There is, says Mr. Mason in page 88, a small letter in one of the places cited from the Directory which completely ruins the cause the citation was intended to support. It does not say in the administration of the sacrament, but sacraments, including baptism, and making this to be an occasion no less special than the supper. So that if the argument, shape it as you please, prove anything, it proves that the Directory prescribes a public fast as often as a child is baptized. Unless this be admitted, the foundation is swept away and the fabric of itself tumbles to the ground. The Directory was never appealed to as prescribing any fast in one case or the other, but merely as admitting that the sacraments are special occasions, and therefore not hostile to the propriety of seeking the Lord by fasting and prayer in prospect of them. The exercise pertains to the persons particularly concerned. Sessions may call to it in prospect of the supper, but they have no power to appoint personal or family fasts. Instead, therefore, of establishing a pernicious distinction between the two sacraments, page 105. While sessions fulfill what belongs to their province, their appointments in regard to the supper rather tend to inspire a proper respect for the other sacrament and intimate the exercise to be suitable in private for those who are concerned in its administration. If the fact be otherwise, as Mr. Mason complains, and with too much reason, page 106, we can only deplore it. The wisest regulations are liable to abuse, because parents cannot reasonably expect the whole congregation should be called to seek the Lord by fasting and prayer with a view to the baptism of their children. It would be absurd and impious for them to conclude that therefore baptism is a trivial matter. Let them learn what account to make of this ordinance, which they know to be equally a sacrament for the manner of the Church in observing the supper, and be admonished to discover in its sphere the same sacred veneration. As for the mighty problem, how many communicants are requisite to a public fast? Just as many, we reply, as may constitute a public communion. Whether 2 can do so, as well as 10,000, is left to Mr. Mason to determine. Were fasting essential to right observance, or coupled with the supper by positive institution, which had been very strange, then no doubt it behooved to have obtained, however small the number of communicants. The problem is constructed on the supposition that we hold it to be thus essential. Now we only maintain that it is warrantable, and that sessions must judge of its expediency. There may be cases in which it would not be proper. Suppose the very small number of communicants to be one of these, yet where is the similarity between this case and that of baptism, in which, though there be only a parent and child, the administration is as full as that of the supper would be if honored with 10,000 communicants. Let the parent therefore treat the ordinance with the same sacred regard as is shown to the supper in all ordinary cases. Mr. Mason should have remembered, however, that though in the way of his prospered measures being carried into effect, such limited communions as he supposes for the sake of the difficulty may occur, they are not likely to be met with while the present Presbyterian plan is followed out, nor would they long puzzle any church court, even if they were. We are not tied down by the view we entertain of sacramental feasts and thanksgivings, as they are styled.